Advanced Java, April 2015, Part C20, discuss Java server architecture, HTTPS, web container, EJB container, Tomcat web server, and ORB using IIOP or SSL. The various tools use web services are XML registry, database, enterprise information system, JMS, SMTP, JACC provider tools. A container is a runtime environment that provides services such as security and transaction management. Client access at runtime, the browser client access a web application communicating with the web server. Web services Java Enterprise Edition platform is possible to deploy web application that provide web services implemented by Java API. Services for application naming is a naming and directory services bind object to name. Security, the Java authorization contract for the container. Transaction management, a transaction is the indivisible unit of work. Access external system JDBC, it provides the facility for storing, organizing and retrieving data. Messaging is a method of communication between the software components or application. Connector, a Java EE connector architecture enable the integration between Java EE application and existing enterprise information system. Java Mail, a Java Mail API application connect SMTP server in order to send and receive mail. Server administration, the lower right hand corner, the task performed by the administrator of the application server. 21. Explain detailed session management. Session management is a mechanism used by the web container to store the session information for particular user. 4 different technique: cookies, hide and form field, URL rewriting, and HTTP session. The client 1 and the client 2, request ID 123, request ID 134. The web container session ID is 123, session ID is 134. The client interact with the servlet, the web container storing the informations. The HTTP session object is used to store the entire session with the specific client. The client requests the web container. The web container responds the client. The server add web container contain new IDE 101 and the Alex to server. Then web container set attributes for the HTTP session. Creating a new session, HTTP session equal to request.get session, return the session. If the session already exists, it return the existing session, else create a new session. HTTP session equal to get session true. Get session true is always return a new session. Getting the pre-existing session, HTTP session equal to request.get session of false, return pre-existing session. Destroying the session dot invalidate, destroy the session. Some important method of servlet HTTP session. Methods and the description. Long get creation time, return the time session was created. String get ID, it returns a string containing unified identifier. Long get last accessed time, return the last time the client sent request associated with session. Int get max inactive interval, return maximum time interval and second. Void invalidate, destroy the session. Boolean is new, return true if the session is new, else false. Void set max active interval, specify the time in second after the servlet container will invalidate the session. 22. What is the EJB deployment descriptor? The deployment descriptor is a file which contains EJB server, which classes make up the bean implementation, home interfaces, remote interfaces, also indicate the behavior of one EJB with other. The deployment descriptor, generally called EJB jar file XML, in the directory meta inf of the client application. It also includes the various session deployment descriptor, doc type declaration, summary of the deployment descriptor elements, a description of deployment descriptor elements. Deployment descriptor, EJB structural information, EJB name, class, home and remote interfaces, bean type. Application assembly information such as EJB references, security role references, method permission and the container transaction attributes. EJB roles and the deployment descriptor. specifying the deployment descriptor. Information is required as the bean provider perform. The bean provider create the standard EJB deployment descriptor using the XML. Developing the WebLogic Enterprise EJB application, getting started using the WebLogic EJB deployer. The file format using WebLogic EJB deployer accept the standard, extended and deployment EJB jar file. Doc type declaration. Summarize the deployment descriptor element. Assembly descriptor contain assembly application information. EJB role as application assembler. CMP field describe container management managed field. Bean provider EJB role. Container transactions specify the transaction scope of EJB method invocations. EJB role as application assembler. Description provide text describing the parent element. EJB role bean provider of application. So many applications are defined in this. We have defined EJB name, specify the EJB name bean provider of application assembler. EJB ref declare the reference to another EJB home bean provider. EJB ref type specify the expected type of the reference EJB. EJB role bean provider. Then ENV entry name specify the EJB environment entry bean provider. AENV entry value is the EJB environment entry, the bean provider or the application assembler. Then the large icon specify the name of the file containing the bean provider. Method describe EJB name home or remote interfaces application assembler. Method in method name specifies EJB method or asterisk character. EJB role application assembler. The persistent type specify the bean persistent management type bean provider. The prim key class qualified the primary key class of EJB role bean provider. The primary key field also manage persistent EJB role bean provider. Then the remote specify fully qualified of EJB remote interface EJB role bean provider. Then REST type specifies the type of the data source, example bean EJB role bean provider. Then role link the security role EJB role application assembler. Role name is specify the security role application assembler. Security role role the reference in EJB code bean provider. Session type is a session bean provider. Session declare the session bean exam EJB role bean provider. The transaction attributes specify how the container must manage the transaction boundaries. Delegating the method invocation EJB business method EJB role application assembler. Descriptions of deployment descriptor elements assembly descriptor synapses contain application assembly information. Syntax element assembly descriptor security role method permission container transaction. EJB role application assembler used in EJB jar. Synapses describe container management. Syntax element CMP field description field name. EJB role bean provider used entity container transaction. Synapses manage transaction scope. Syntax element container transaction description method plus transaction attribute. EJB role application assembler used in application descriptor. Synapses provide text describing the parent element. Bean syntax element description PC data. EJB role provider of application assembler. 23. How was RMA set up and process? RMA stand for remote method invocation. This mechanism allow the object residing one system access invoke the object running on another JVM. RMA used to build the application is a remote communication between the Java program. It is provided the Java RMA packages architecture inside the server program. The remote object created and reference of the object made available for the client. The client program requires a remote object on the server, tries to invoke the method. This architecture of RMA application, client stub, RRL transport layer, server skeleton, RRL transport layer. RRL is a virtual connection. Transport layer is a network connection. Transport layer is a client and server. Manage the existing connection. Stub is representation of remote objects at client. A skeleton is a object that reside the server side. RRL manage the references made by the client to the remote object. working RMA application. When the client make a call to the remote object, the client side RRL receive the request, invoke the method call invoke method, the object remote references. The RRL server side passes the request to the skeleton. The result is passed back to the client. Marshalling and unmarshalling. The parameters of object are serialized known as marshalling. At the server side, the packed parameters are unbundled and then required the method is invoked known as unmarshalling. RMI registry is a namespace which all the server objects are placed. Each time the server create the object, the register this method, the RMI registry using the bind and the rebind method. To invoke the remote object, the client need the reference of that object. Client server then RMI registry interact one by one. First, the client invoke this method using this fetched object and bind the object server to RMI registry. The RMI registry fetches the object into client. The goals of RMIA: to minimize complexity application, preserve type safety, distributed garbage collection, minimize the difference between working with the local and the remote object. Explain how do the beans JSP component. The JSP use bean components create the instance of specific Java bean class. If the instance already exists, it is retrieved. Otherwise, a new instance of bean is created. JSP set property and JSP get property are used to manipulate the properties of the specific bean. The JSP use bean ID name, bean name, class equal to bean, class scope equal to page request or session. Next, what is JSP initiate method? A JSP initiate method Java X Servlet.jsp. The JSP page interface similar to the initiate method of the servlet. This method invoked by the container only once the JSP is initialized. The constructor instant the initiate to initialize the servlet. The servlet configuration, although it does not apply anymore, the servlet container still you can ARG constructor. We don't access the servlet configuration or servlet context. 25. Explain JSP action in brief. The JSP action 24. The explain JSP action in brief. The JSP action can be used to print the script expression to create and store the Java beans for many other things. They are used to construct XML syntax to control the behavior of servlet engine. The validate viable actions also include in JSP include the file at the time when the page is requested. JSP use bean find or instantiate the Java bean, set property, set the property of Java bean, set get property. The get property insert the property of Java bean output. JSP forward the request to the new page. A plugin is used to generate the browser specific HTML to specify the Java applet. Java JSP action. Java server page actions or the action tag or construct that follows XML syntax. The behavior of the servlet engine is controlled this action using the JSP action. A file inserted into another page dynamically reuse a bean component. Discuss a model supported by JMS 25. The two JMS message model. The JMS support the two different ways of messaging between producer and the consumer. Two messaging models are PTP, point to point message delivered to the one receiver, pub or sub message delivered to the multiple recipient. The point to point, the PTP model is used to enable the application send a message to have the message received by the single consumer. PTP model supported by JMS by the queue. The queue allow the messages to come in and to consume by the single receiver. After the particular consumer take the message of the queue, the message is no longer available for other consumer. PTP model, a message producer preferred as a queue sender and message consumer referred as queue receiver. The messaging application can have multiple sender and receiver, but a message from a sender only delivered to the single receiver in PTP model. Publish or subscribe, pub or sub. Messages model in JMS provided the topic. JMS pub or sub model. The message producer in the pub or submodel is called the topic publisher and the message consumer referred as topic subscriber. Unlike the PTP message model, the pub or sub messages model allow the multiple recipient to receive the same message. JMS interfaces provided the main packages of java.jms. This application create necessary object for both PTP, pub or sub model. Connection factory. The JMS Java X connection factory is a factory that provide connection for client JMS application. It is usually configured by the administrator, give the name and then register with the naming service. The queue connection factory and the topic connection factory interfaces extend the connection factory interface to provide the unique factory for the queue. Connection. The Java JMS connection represent open channel the messaging services. This connection used to create Java X.jms session can be used to the client. In some cases, a vendor has a single instance of the connection multiplies all JMS communication from the client messaging system over the single connection. This is done because creating and maintaining many connection is very resource intensive. The underlying implementation will take care of the details of multiplexing requests. Connections normally are thread safe and support multiple client accessing the connection at the same time. Thank you.